Welcome to Art Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about a recent story that revealed that an organization called the Canadian Anti-Hate Network received more than $250,000 in taxpayer funding to publish an educational toolkit that includes some pretty controversial claims. To discuss this story and the organization behind it, I'm pleased to be joined today by Jamie Sarkonak, a freelance columnist who recently published a piece on this in the National Post. Jamie, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks for having me on.
So I guess maybe for the viewer's sake, we should start right at the beginning. What happened here? What is the story and why is it so controversial?
Yeah, what happened is the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which is a federally funded, not federally funded right now, but they had received a large federal grant of about $270,000 from the federal government. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network published a toolkit for, it's like an educational resource, for schools to teach teachers, students, and the general community in schools about hate in spreading among students and how to deal with such hate. In this toolkit, they included the red ensign as a potential symbol of far-right hatred that could be spreading around schools, which is the former Canadian flag, which was our flag until 1965. It's controversial because it was our flag that we fought under in the World Wars, and it hasn't been too much of an issue until just recently. So, yeah.
So I know there's some other controversial elements, but maybe we could touch on the red ensign. As you said, it is our former flag. It was our flag only about 50 years ago. What was the rationale in the toolkit as to why this might be considered a symbol of hate now?
The rationale is some far-right groups have co-opted it and are using the red ensign as a symbol of just returning to a time in Canada when the population was more white. So they're tying it to a movement that is sort of wistful and desiring of those previous demographics in Canada. And they're saying that since this group uses this symbol, the rest of Canada, if we're to use that symbol, we should be cautious about using it since it now has those connections to far-right groups.
I wonder how some of our veterans feel about that. Now, since this story broke and it has raised such a stink, my understanding is that they've made some changes as sort of in response to this, maybe acknowledging that perhaps they went a little too far. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, they amended their toolkit to say this should be taken in context. It's often waived by veterans. It has a history that is more than just far-right groups, but they do maintain that if a student is using the symbol, the red ensign, a teacher should be concerned and look into it because it could be a symbol that, or it could mean that they are participating in far-right groups. So, yeah.
Seems like a stretch for, say, an elementary school student, but that's neither here nor there. You also note in your column, speaking of sort of teachers paying attention and taking note of these things, I know that the toolkit encourages teachers to sort of monitor students to see if they say problematic things or that they support problematic causes. They mentioned Donald Trump specifically. What does the toolkit suggest that teachers do about these sort of problematic comments or problematic students?
Yeah, it says that teachers can respond in a range of ways, anything from immediately just verbally correcting the student, or it could mean following up, possibly reporting this to the higher ups in schools' administrative systems. So it can be arranged depending on how severe this support and this conduct is. Now, it's not quite clear what support for a problematic petition specific should be, but they do make it clear that the teacher should address it promptly. The teacher should have activist literature on hand to educate the student and I suppose correct their views.
Interesting. So this toolkit is essentially encouraging teachers to sort of be on constant alert for any sort of problematic views being expressed by their students, which I think some people might find to be a little bit much. But lots more to dig into here. We're going to take a short break and be right back. We're talking about an organization called the Canadian Anti-Hate Network today with Jamie Sarkonak, who's a freelance columnist and has written about this organization. Now, we've talked about the controversy over their school toolkit and the Red Ensign, Jamie, but my understanding is this is certainly not the only instance where this organization has made some eyebrow-raising claims or statements. So you, as the expert, I know you've looked quite a bit into this organization. Are there any sort of notable examples that stick out to you?
Yeah, more prominently and more recently, the chair of the organization during the Freedom Convoy protests did take a photo of a very anti-Semitic conspiratorial flyer and say this was found by my friend at the convoy protests. Turns out that photo came from, it was taken a while ago in Miami at a completely different event, so it really had no connection to the Freedom Convoy protests, but it was shared around at the time, for example. In terms of other
Sorry,
types
did
of
the chair?
claims,
So if I could ask you about that flyer, Jamie, was there ever a apology, or was that taken down, and like was it sort of clarified that that was not actually something from the convoy?
after it had blown up in the news, I don't recall if it was. I can't recall that, but what I remember what happening is it just dying out, similar to there was a hoax where some individuals tried to set fire to an apartment that was originally discussed as if it was connected to the Freedom Convoy, when really it was not. It was just a couple bad actors at that place at that time with no connection. So no, I can't recall if it was retracted actually, but I know it had circulated widely in that time.
Interesting. And any other examples that leap to mind for you for this organization?
Well, throughout various times across their website, they have discussed that freedom of speech should be limited in situations when it comes to media, when it comes to online engagement. Um, so, so broadly, no specific claims online, but general want to regulate speech at a greater degree. They've also appeared in House of Commons committees as well, discussing hatred and online harms. My view is they take a rather expansive view and often use the opportunity to point out problems with conservatism when it comes to extremism, but not really anyone else.
That's interesting because I know they also present themselves as a nonpartisan organization. In your view, sort of, watching their comments or reading their comments that they've made publicly, is that the case? Do you think that they are, are they fair critics across the board, or do they tend to focus on one side of the spectrum rather than the other?
I find they tend to focus on one side. They're more focused with far right extremism, and that's the big focus for them. They're a federally incorporated nonprofit. They don't have formal partisan ties, but it often happens where their talking points and their advocacy often lines up very neatly with what the federal government wishes to do in the Canadian Heritage Department, which is focus greatly on far right extremism rather than broader cultural issues of unity in Canada and just general disenfranchisement. It's rather of a political bent, is what you see. They've even appeared on CBC, for example, to discuss protests at Liberal campaign speeches just from far right extremism points, when really we've seen a lot more protests in general at political gatherings just because of people being disenfranchised and frustrated with government.
Do you think it's fair to say that they do not take a very robust view of free speech?
I would say so. They liken this kind of discussion of online harm as the equivalent to yelling fire in a crowded theater, which is is a bit of a stretch, really, because first of all, yelling fire in a crowded theater, making everyone fear for their lives, that, yeah, that is already, that's considered causing a disturbance in some ways. There are ways to deal with that kind of speech already under our current law. Um, what they want to do is sort of extend that into, or what they appear to be want to be doing is extend that into just general political disagreement. So, voicing support for Trump wanting to build a wall, for example, which is a policy to regulate a border. You might think
Right.
it's problematic. You might think there are problems with it, but they're saying that that needs to be quickly corrected by a teacher to step in.
Yeah. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about hate speech. And to do that, I'm joined here by Jamie Sarkonak, who's a freelance columnist and recently wrote on this subject in the National Post. Now, Jamie, it's fair to say that the idea of hate speech is not something a lot of people like. Being hateful is not a fun thing or a pleasant thing. And the organization in question, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, they hold themselves out as fighting hard against free speech as a sort of scourge on society. But I guess I put it to you, given the problems with this organization's view on these things, what do you say to those people who argue that hateful speech and ideas are, in fact, a problem and need to be dealt with, and that it's better to have groups like the Anti-Hate Network sort of flagging this stuff and trying to equip people to deal with it?
Yeah, I'd say generally that's correct, but we take different ideological approaches. So for a classical liberal view, it's, free speech matters, but, if you say something that's bad and hateful, it should be able to be explored and then corrected through debate. There's plenty of logical and rational ways to dispel this kind of stuff without calling for greater regulation, without calling for people to be proactively silenced. Um, what what they're doing is useful in some sense. This 50-page guidebook that they offered gives a lot of information about different fringe right-wing groups that, if you're a teacher or a parent, you probably never heard about, and frankly, a lot of people haven't ever heard about. So, there's good information there. It's just trying to extend that further into any policy discussion, broadly using the words problematic politician, problematic policy, things that are well within the realm of talking about. It's a little overreaching. The students, for example,
Mm.
if they like Trump's policies, should be able to talk about them and argue about them. And hey, if they're bad, have other students come in to give the opposing side. What the toolbook or what the guidebook would suggest is to not enable that conversation at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's one thing to provide information, and it's another to sort of provide all these recommendations about what to do about people who say certain things, which I think is what's happening with this particular guidebook. Also, is it fair to say that the main reason this is controversial is not that this guidebook exists; it's that it was paid for with taxpayer money. Canadians are being forced to pay for this, and if you look at something like the Red Ensign, for example, if you're for example, a veteran who fought under the Red Ensign, your tax dollars are going towards a booklet that is essentially warning that the flag you fought under is a hate symbol.
Yeah, it would be as simple as not giving a grant to a political like a very politically oriented organization. I think if that wasn't there, this would be a lot more broad. But with this toolbook, for example, it was not directed by government, but it was under the financial support of the government. And then when it was released, it was done in a launch that was facilitated by a minister, a federal minister, with the Canadian government's logo on it and resources to do sort of the media push on it. So yeah, like it's a lot of taxpayer money going into something that has a certain political bent. There was a lot of discussion um, about the government giving grants to organizations to employ students for the summer and requiring them to have values attestations, for example, on the conservative side. And people didn't generally like that. And this is kind of it has echoes of that for me.
Yeah, it's fair to say that it's going to be very controversial if there's sort of an ideological litmus test for organizations that receive taxpayer money.
Yeah, I'd say so. And it's not clear, like on the granting procedure, what made the government want them to give the grant. It was part of a larger anti-hate initiative where plenty of groups were given grants to do this kind of work. But yeah, it's ideological, and it sort of calls into question the partisanship of the granting mechanisms and the department and all that. So if they could just stick to the basics, there's hate speech in criminal law. There's clearly hateful material out there. That would be far less of a problem. But when they extend it into politicians, policies, and use vaguer language around it, it becomes kind of a bigger question.
Yeah, I think it might be a matter of taxpayer money funding information versus taxpayer money funding what essentially amounts to advocacy for certain things. And I think it's fair to argue that there's a difference between those things. We're going to take a very short break, and we're going to be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about hate speech with Jamie Sarkonak, who's a freelance columnist who recently wrote about this topic in the National Post. Jamie, we're talking about a particular organization that's been in the spotlight over some controversial statements, but is it fair to say that the view that this group takes on free speech and how extensive and expansive it should be, do they represent a significant number of people in Canadian society in essentially not viewing free speech as being as important as sort of going after harmful or hateful speech?
Yeah, there's certainly a chunk of the Canadian population that thinks that wants a bit more regulation on free speech. Of course, we have the right to free speech in our charter. We also have a reasonable limit that can be set on that right to free speech. So different people draw that reasonable limit line in different places. So they're drawing it more on we need to regulate this side, whereas on generally it's the right. That's how that falls along, is they opt for more libertarian views of this, and we need to regulate the worst of it, but generally the stuff should be open for debate.
And that has not always historically been the case, though, has it? Is it fair to say that historically folks on the left, or who would call themselves progressives now, tended to have a much stronger commitment to free speech in the past, and we're seeing that has changed dramatically in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a bit more skepticism from skepticism of larger bodies regulating what you can and cannot say. Think around the 9/11 era, there was a lot more hesitance to increase government power over, your actions online and such. But it's since sort of shifted, I think, with the fear of greater division in society and um, the rise of these fringe groups. I mean, I don't think they're not big in number whatsoever, but when they make it around the internet, they sure seem scary at times. So people are more inclined to regulate up so that these individuals can't have as big of a platform. Um, that's so that's some people's view of what should be regulated. Whether it should be the case is, I don't think that there's consensus in Canada that there should be increased regulation right there.
I guess I wanted your thoughts on whether or not you think this approach works. I mean, this is an organization that, I mean, we could say they have good intentions. They obviously want to fight hate. Nobody likes hate. But do you think the approach that they're counseling would work? Do you think it would be effective in sort of eliminating hate and removing dangers that people face?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that the best way to do this is let broadly conversation happen, and the correct ideas win out at the end of the day. I mean, it's quite logical that people should be treated fairly and equally, and that should be allowed to be talked about. If you shut down conversation, you can't really deliberate that. Especially in the school context, you're imagining a bunch of teens have their reputation of being a bit more rebellious. So, in particular, in that space, I would not suggest shutting down conversation, because you're kind of just asking for people to explore forbidden ideas. It's much better to let them engage on the topic openly.
Yeah, you mentioned too, in terms of charter, we have reasonable limits. We already have laws against things like incitement to violence, libel. So there are clearly existing tools there for governments to use where there are infringements, or I should say abuses of free speech that cross the line. Do you think it's a matter of maybe using those existing tools in a better way, especially when it comes to the online environment, rather than coming up with new ways to muzzle speech?
Absolutely, law enforcement is under-resourced, and same with prosecution offices across the country. You often get like charges will happen in these cases. People can get charged with a crime, but then it has to go through the do we have the resources to prosecute this when there are lots of other murders happening or violent assaults? And if there were greater resources with the tools that we have already, I imagine it would be quite a bit different, actually, in a good way.
Interesting. So you're saying we already have the laws, we already have them being applied, but there's not a lot of follow through.
Yeah, these kinds of laws need to get enforced, and if they're not going to be, you might see proliferation of that kind of stuff, and radicalization.
Okay, fair enough. Well, very important topic, and some very controversial, comments and work done by an organization that says it's fighting hate, but seems to take a very dim view of free speech. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, Jamie, to talk about it today. And I want to thank you, the viewer. We'll see you next time on Our Canada, Our Future.